Rima, you were talking about your move to Canada, and one of the things that you really liked about the country when you moved here was freedom of speech and some of the freedoms that you had here. Um, could you just finish up that thought and let us know, has our country changed a lot in the past 30 years in terms of some of those reasons why you came here, and have we gotten better or worse?
Well, we are who we are, and we got better at many levels, but we got really worse on the freedom of expression, academic freedom part. And the question is now, why are we still allowing this to happen? So, what are the mechanisms that are allowing it? Why are people not denouncing it more and more? I personally think we need to come back to the principle of freedom of expression for all, not for some and not others. No violence to all, not for some, for others, to the basics, basically, those values, Canadian values.
Mhm. And I can see why you'd be saying that. We've certainly seen a lot of news stories over the years about a clampdown on freedom of speech on campuses where people get shouted down if their opinion happens to not be the politically correct flavor of the day. Mark, I want to shift gears a little bit and just ask you about one of the more serious charges that activists will level at our nation of Canada, and that is that they suggest that we're a country with systemic racism. I know that this is a topic that comes up in your book. Is there any kind of consensus among the authors?
Well, Matthew Lau from Toronto writes about this notion of systemic racism and basically does what I'd call a Thomas Sowell analysis, if you're familiar with the American economist, but for Canada. So he looks into the data and finds, people with, pale faces like mine are in the middle of the pack for incomes. If you come from an East Asian background, for example, you're likely at the top of the heap in terms of incomes. And there's other reasons that Matthew details in the 1867 project to say no, systemic racism did exist in Canada. Prior to the 1950s, for example, you could be discriminated based on your color, accommodation and hiring, no longer after the 1950s in the case of Ontario. But Matthew Lau, I think, does a nice job of taking down that notion in the book.
And could one look at this beyond simply income? Are there other factors that might actually contribute to systemic racism still today in Canada against maybe certain races who maybe people who aren't from Southeast Asia?
Well, Matthew makes the case that it's reverse racism these days. I think one has to be very careful in definitions. People sometimes meet a bigot or someone who's prejudiced and say that's systemic. No, systemic is when, for example, in San Francisco 100 years ago, you get the whites refusing to allow Chinese people of Chinese origin into their hospitals. And the Chinese in San Francisco literally had to set up their own hospitals, or not admitting Jews in universities 70 or 80 years ago, or limiting the number. That is systemic racism.
Hmm. Yeah, it certainly seems like we've come a long ways from some of the terrible examples from our past. Rima, I want to ask you about this question. Are there ways that, do you think that there is any systemic racism in Canada today? And if so, what would those examples be?
I was so happy to read the chapter of Matt Low, excellent chapter indeed. For me, systemic racism, first thing I would ask, what's the definition? What do we mean by it? Systemic in which systems? Where precisely? And then show me the data so to see that. So no, personally, I don't think there is systemic racism. If not, my family and myself would have not immigrated to Canada. I'm not talking about the past or what happened in the past. I'm talking right now. Coming from where I come from, Civil War, 15 years of growing up there, I'm very careful with slogans. Sometimes they could be empty, sometimes very emotionally charged. Sometimes you could be killed over a slogan. So we need to be careful and really think, what does it mean, and what are the statistics, etc.
Mark, Sir John A. McDonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, is a figure that figures prominently in your book and many parts of it. What is it that people don't know about his history? He's come under the microscope quite a bit, but what are some things that people maybe don't know about him?
Well, Greg Piasatsky, the Toronto author who writes the chapter in the 1867 project on McDonald, says, look, first of all, in residential schools, it was required at the time. First Nations leaders had to ask for them, and 120 of them did around the time of McDonald if they wanted residential schools. He goes into famine relief. He goes into how McDonald set up what we know now as the RCMP to protect first settlers from later settlers. So that chapter is a good explanation of all this.
We'll pick up more in just a moment.